What is SpecDD? SpecDD was developed as a hybrid agile software development method for managing software projects. It's designed for both agile and traditional processes. Terran Zhou, the founder of SpecDD, had found that while all these different methodologies had benefits, not one single methodology incorporated all of them together. And so he developed SpecDD. A little bit of background on the current software development industry. As you can see from both these charts, both small businesses, less than 1,000, as well as enterprises, more than 1,000, the most common development method is simply no methodology at all. 38% of small businesses utilize no development method. And without any method, there's no standard, there's no common practices, there's no way to measure how effective or ineffective something is, because there's simply no standard at all. The next most common development method is Agile. And Agile is the buzzword these days. 30% of small businesses and enterprises, so across the board, utilize some form of Agile. However, when you dig deeper into this research, you'll notice that pure Agile is extremely rare, simply because it's extremely difficult to implement. So while a lot of these companies will say they are Agile, it is not the pure Agile that all the textbooks say it should be. And then, of course, you have your more traditional, old-school methodologies such as iterative, waterfall, and measurement-based. So as I mentioned, the companies that do use Agile, you'll see the minority, 27%, use a single Agile method. This is not even pure Agile, but they simply choose one single Agile method to utilize. The majority, 38%, use a combination. They use multiple Agile methods in order to create a development standard for their company. Now, company A may use multiple Agile methods, and company B might use multiple Agile methods, but you can be assured that their Agile methods that they choose that make up this combination are not going to be the same either. Again, there is no standard for the multiple Agile methods, or even for the Agile and traditional methods. They are integrated. Some integrate from here, some integrate from there. They simply pick and choose what suits their company. Now, while there's nothing wrong with that, there is, again, no standardized methodology, no standardized hybrid methodology. For the pure Agile ones, the pure Agile companies, the most common used is Scrum. I'm sure most everybody here has heard of Scrum. A little bit of basic background information. Some of the standard Scrum concepts are a user story. Coming from the customer, these are the user defined requirements, the things that need to be developed, told in a kind of a story-like format. You, of course, have a product backlog, simply a place to put the items that will, in the future, be developed for the product. You have your releases at the end of every sprint. And then you have your burndown reports. These are all pretty standard concepts. The different roles in Scrum, I've always found these names extremely funny. You have your pigs, product owners, Scrum Master, your entire development team are all pigs. And then on the flip side, you have your chickens. Chickens are your users, your stakeholders, and yes, your managers. All chickens. SpecDD will take some of these, again, because it's hybrid, it will take some of these concepts, but it will also take concepts from other methodologies and integrate them all into one standard, acceptable hybrid method. So the Scrum process, not sure if anybody's seen this diagram in the Agile Scrum trainings, but again, it's fairly standard. You have your start, your input from the customer marketing manager. They're the ones that come up with potentially new features, things that need to be redesigned, re-implemented, your ideas, possible defects, your new features. These go through the product owner. They can't go directly into your development team. There would be no prioritization, no standardization, no review process. So of course they have to go through a product owner, singular, who then puts these items into the product backlog, which then gets reviewed, planned out in the sprint planning meeting, and is then pushed into a sprint backlog. Now the sprint is of course a cycle of iteration, and this is where the multiple iterations, the multiple cycles come in. These sprints are where your dev team develops those features. You have a Scrum Master to oversee this entire process. And then from those sprints, within those sprints, you have your daily stand-up meetings. And at the end of those sprints, the release is of course a piece of working software, the only deliverable in the Scrum process. You'll have your sprint review meeting to review the working software. And then as a follow-up, you'll have your retrospective meeting. This is simply a meeting at the end of the process in order to review, to kind of see what worked well, what didn't work well in this entire process, with the ultimate goal being, of course, to improve upon it. So that's the Scrum process. Pretty standard. Now here we have a training poll real quickly. A couple of easy questions. Make sure everybody's still awake. Question number 1. Is a story a requirement? Is a story a requirement? And question number 2. How do you manage requirements? So for question 1, in Agile development, your standard Agile development, a story is typically a requirement. Does that sound true? Or no, a story is not a requirement, but simply an abstract of a requirement. It comes from the requirement, it's built off of the requirement, but it is not exactly a requirement. So question number 1, the answer is actually the second. A story is not the same as a requirement. It's not exactly the same as a requirement. It is an abstract built off of requirement. It takes its details from the requirement, but a story is not a requirement. Question number 2, how do you manage requirements? Typically provide functional design, user design before a sprint? Or do you only provide these designs during a sprint? Or we don't document functional user interface design at all? I think everybody knows that this third option is simply a filler. And lastly, for some stories we should add design, for others we should not. Now, this one is sort of a trick question because we don't really say in what context are we managing our requirements. For your standard Agile, for your pure Agiles, you provide functional design and UI design before a sprint. These changes, these designs need to be discussed, need to be written out before a sprint so that the developers can develop them. However, no changes can be done during that sprint. That's pure Agile. For SpecDD, however, the answer we're looking for is the fourth choice. For some stories, we add design. For the ones that we can, for the ones that we have a good understanding, or possibly we've done that requirement before, then we add the design, functional, UI, whatever we can. However, this is not a necessity. We do not have to have a design before entering the sprint, before developing that story. The idea for SpecDD is that we accommodate for change much more easily than pure Agile. During a sprint, as we're developing, as we're in the midst of creating this, is when we best know how that design should be designed out. So for some stories we add a design, for others we do not before the sprint. And then as the sprint is ongoing, or even after the sprint, when we better understand the requirement, when we better understand the story, that's when we add in additional design. Now, our key here is that the design added can be added at any point. However, it must be documented, and that is a very important piece. Any design, any change that we do must be documented. We accept it at any point in the sprint, but it must be documented. And this is something that we'll cover later on as well. 2 more questions for this training poll. Question number 3, how much testing effort should be involved for each sprint? How much testing effort should be involved for each sprint? Option A here, test as much as needed to ensure that working software is defect-free. How many people here really believe that working software will ever be defect-free? Second option, a good Agile will finish a sprint with no defects or almost defect-free. Almost just as impossible. Option 3, it's not necessary. Developers should focus on the development work and have no testing efforts whatsoever. Or option 4, just enough testing so that the sprint workload can be finished at a desired quality level. Now, desired quality level may be a little confusing. That is simply the quality level that has been defined at the beginning of the sprint. Meaning, this quality, in order for this working software to be considered successful and a deliverable, the quality level will be defined by how many finished tasks we have and an acceptable number of defects, which is something that the planning committee, the product owner, the dev team will all get together and discuss. Question number 4, how to find defects for a development sprint. Defects should be found by whoever and whenever possible. Fixing them is another matter, completely. But defects should be found by the end users, should be found by the Agile team, and should most definitely be found by the QA team, since that is their job. Okay, Continuing with the Scrum meetings, the Scrum background information. The meetings that typically occur, everybody knows that the sprint planning meeting, this occurs once every sprint cycle, so once every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the duration of your sprint. You have your daily stand-up meeting, which meets, as you guessed, daily. You have your sprint review meeting, once also at the end of every sprint. And you'll have your retrospective meeting. Now the retrospective meeting can occur as often as once every sprint. However, if there are no major changes in the process later on, when a company has been using Scrum for a very long time, retrospective meetings can be drawn out to maybe every couple of iterations, or maybe even once a quarter or twice a quarter. It is still, of course, beneficial to have these simply to provide retrospect. Another very common concept for Scrum, another popular idea, is the Burndown Chart. SpecDD also utilizes this Burndown Chart, so a quick explanation. Should be pretty self-explanatory, but for those of you who are completely new to Agile, here we have a sample Burndown chart. You'll see that across the left, it is the amount of remaining effort, and across the bottom is the timeline. So a Burndown chart, a good-looking Burndown chart, will always start at the upper left and end at the bottom right at 0. That is your ideal. Do all of them look like that? Of course not. You have your light blue line without the dots. Those are your remaining tasks. So at the very beginning, day 0, that will be your maximum, hopefully. Meaning, the tasks that have been assigned to this sprint should not exceed the upper left starting point. Otherwise, in Scrum, that means that you are adding tasks to your sprint, which is a big no-no. The progression of this light blue line should, of course, be going to the right and down as your remaining tasks get finished. The darker blue line with the dots is your remaining effort. Now, the effort here is the number of hours that will still be needed in order to finish those tasks. The green line is simply a standard ideal burn down. It's a straight line from the maximum to 0, from day 0 to the end of your sprint. And then the orange bars are your completed tasks. So you should see an orange bar whenever the light blue line takes a dip. Now the opposite of the Burndown chart is your velocity report. So the reverse, meaning the ideal velocity report, starts from the lower left, 0, and gains momentum and gets higher and higher as you near your end date for the sprint. So we have our brown line, which is our cumulative closed spec points, which means as we finish each item, whatever it was worth, whatever its point value was, gets added on. And then the blue line is, again, the tasks. So as we close each task, it goes higher and higher, ideally. Now, so far with Scrum, we've discussed the basic concepts. However, there are some limitations of this pure Agile methodology. There really isn't a clear model for large projects with multiple Agile teams. With these enterprises having multiple teams spread across countries, time zones, working on the same project, working on multiple large projects, there's really no scalability coming from a pure agile methodology. There's no clear model also for integrating QA testing with the development sprint cycles. QA testing in pure agile simply waits until the working software has been delivered, at which point the QA finally gets to see it for the first time. And the testing occurs, of course, after the sprint has already completed. If an extremely high priority defect is found, it has no option but to wait until the next sprint. And if we're talking about a 3 to 4 week sprint cycle, that's a 3 to 4 week delay. There's no support for requirements-driven, meaning total traceability in pure agile. A requirement, yes, drives the development, but then it ends there. The QA testing tests the working software. It does not test based off of the requirements. And this is another major beneficial point for SpecDD. The basic premise of pure agile is that the team is committed to the project. If the team is not committed, then the process collapses. If somebody leaves the team, process collapses. If adoption fails, then the time will have been wasted and some people may leave. If the adoption of pure agile in the company fails, then people leave. People get frustrated, it doesn't work, they've tried it, then they leave. Pure agile is actually very difficult to implement. I have had many customers that have tried it, found it unsuccessful, and they've either gone back to their old traditional ways or they moved on to some sort of mixed methodology. What is an ideal agile development method? We've gone over some basic concepts of pure agile, we've gone over some limitations, but let's brainstorm a bit. A really good software development methodology can improve teamwork productivity. Right? A good method helps the team produce better results. That makes everybody look good. It has innovation capacity, meaning that while it is a standard, while it is a methodology to be followed, there can be changes, innovation incorporated into the methodology. It is not set in stone. It is not so strict that you have to follow it. Another good point of an ideal method is sustainable success. If a methodology is successful only once, what's the use? We need repeatable success. Sustainable and repeatable. And finally, a good software development methodology should have scalable success. A company of 3 should be able to use it. A company of 3,000 should also be able to use it. Should be able to keep using it. Should be able to repeatedly use it. That actually will end the first session here. Introduction, Scrum basics, and a little bit of food for thought on an ideal agile development methodology. Thanks for participating. and I'll see you next time.